welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you, but of course, the primary theme continues to be the much anticipated G20 Summit that's coming up in India later this week. All right. Ahead of the G20 Summit in New Delhi later this week, India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S Jaishankar has broken his silence on the absentees who have been making headlines of late. Both Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping have chosen to skip the summit and send other leaders to represent their respective countries instead. Many have wondered if this could take some of the sheen off India's G20 Summit. Now, in an interview to news agency ANI, Dr. Jaishankar has said the abstentions have nothing to do with India and that this isn't the first time that a G20 Summit will have a prominent leader missing in action. In fact, the minister says it doesn't matter who represents a country. What matters is what stand they take on important issues. Listen in.
Not really. I mean, look, I think at different points of time in G20, there have been some presidents or prime ministers who, for whatever reason, have chosen not to come themselves. But, that country and that country's position is obviously reflected by whoever is the representative on that occasion. So you had some occasions where you had a president or two, sometimes three, who have not themselves come. But I do think my sense from talking to the ministers certainly, and I know the Sherpas are in touch with each other. They are right now trying to hammer out the final document. I think everybody is coming with a great deal of seriousness. I mean,
will it have an impact on the outcome of the meet?
I would put it this way, that the issues are there. These are not issues that are this morning being taken up. I mean, there's a whole gestation period of 8-9 months where at different levels ministers or officials have tried to progress an issue. So this is like a culmination. These are really about 16-18 processes which are all coming together to be stitched up together to produce a summit.
All right. For more on this story, let's now go across to Ramakrishnan Sridharan, consulting editor with News9, who joins us live from Washington, D.C. Shri, welcome back to Global Lens. You heard India's External Affairs Minister there in that interview addressing a question that seems to be uppermost in most people's minds ahead of India's G20 Summit. What will be the impact of the high-profile abstentions? The Chinese president and the Russian president will be missing in action. Now, Dr. Jaishankar says this is not the first time that a high-profile leader will not represent their country at a G20 summit. It's happened before. And he says it's really not about who represents them. It could be the head of state, it could be somebody deputed by them. What matters is what they bring to the table, what stand they take on a certain issue. Would you agree?
So, Neha, Dr. Jaishankar is not just India's foreign minister, but a seasoned, well-respected, globally respected diplomat, and now respected internationally in administration as well for his, very, very mature take on issues. So when he says that, this is it's not a slight to India, and this is, a country's free. There are instances when leaders don't come. We have to, go with respect his words, definitely. But let's, look at what is a missed opportunity from the point of view of China. Now, Russia is understandable because, Putin is busy with the war, and he's got other preoccupations, that he needs to take care of. But Mr. Xi Jinping runs the second largest economy, as populous a country as India. Now, he had promised to come, and then at the last minute he bailed out. So, there are some reports coming from China, from Japan, which suggest that at a meeting of the Communist Party, where the former leaders and the current leaders meet, Xi Jinping was upbraided and scolded literally for the direction in which China is going. Now, so one theory is that maybe his deputy is being sent, the premier is being sent instead of Xi Jinping. I don't give much credence to that theory, Neha, for a simple reason. It is still very fresh in our memory. Just 10 months ago, how Hu Jintao was unceremoniously hauled literally from the National Assembly after he had sat down right next to Xi Jinping. So one of the things which Mr. Xi Jinping has done over the last 15 years he's been in power is to basically systematically weed out people who were anti-Xi Jinping camp. So now the Politburo, which is the most important body of the Communist Party, that is filled with his loyalists. Now, has a sudden change happened? I mean, it's hard to say. Anything is possible. But as far as I know, this is basically, China, saying that this is how we are going to deal with our isolationism, our issues with US in particular, and the fact that we are now taking a choice to align more with Russia so that we can be a counterbalance to US and European economies. So there is a lot that is going to be missed by his absence. We are now talking about bringing more than 1 billion people from the African Union, 55 member countries, into G20. That's a personal initiative of our Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Now, these are very important issues. How can you have development if a large swathe of population, a large part of the world, is not included in the collective prosperity? Then there are issues on multilateral framework, on debt, on funding of countries that are in trouble. So a lot of key issues were on the table. And it was very important at a time when President Biden is there, Prime Minister Sunak from UK is there, the Canadian Prime Minister is there, Germany Premier is there. When all these great leaders are there, this was a great opportunity for Xi Jinping to have come and at least started moving in a direction which gives other countries comfort and probably signals that China doesn't intend to remain a global pariah, that it is not going to dig in its heels and be the recalcitrant international player that unfortunately it has become of late, Neha.
Well, you're quite right, Shri. You have consistently maintained that this is a blow to multilateral efforts, and whether anyone likes it or not, this question will continue to be asked as to whether the absence of these leaders could in fact cast a shadow on the G20 summit. All right, let's continue to focus on the External Affairs Minister's interview to ANI, where he tackled a whole range of issues ahead of India's G20 summit. He also talked about the Global South, one recurring theme of this summit. Dr. Jaishankar addressed the issue of the Global South, saying Prime Minister Narendra Modi has said time and again that India has emerged as the voice of the Global South, and that this would be the abiding legacy of India's G20 presidency. Listen in to what he said in this interview.
There have been G20 summits before. No other G20 presidency made an effort to get together the developing countries who are not on the table and say, please come sit with us, tell us what are your concerns, and we will distill those concerns and place it before the G20. That's a very unique exercise. Nobody has done it before. So if we have taken the trouble, and we meaning here Prime Minister Modi himself, if 125 countries have been consulted, feel today, yes, what we told India, India has promised us that they will put that issue on the table. I think they have a lot of expectation of India. And as far as the rest of the G20 is concerned, they know that, look, we have always in G20, outside the G20, India has a reputation of being a very constructive player, someone who bridges divides, who kind of somewhere helps to fix problems. So there's a lot of goodwill that we have, and again, I stress to you, I am confident that every one of the G20 coming to Delhi will understand the responsibility that they bear, will understand today that the other 180 countries of the world are looking to them to set directions, and that they cannot afford to fail them.
Let's go back to Sri at this point. Sri, the External Affairs Minister essentially is saying what has been said by multiple other ministers, including the Prime Minister himself in recent months, that India has emerged as the voice of the global South, and that this is going to be the leitmotif of India's G20 presidency, and that this is what in fact makes India's G20 presidency unique and unlike any other.
Absolutely, Neha. So I think India does have the moral authority to be heard by these developing countries, which at the moment feel marginalized. Why? Because, our ethos as a country is reflected in our foreign policy as well. Now, we were a country that was colonized. We have been plundered. But our answer to all those issues have been ahimsa. We did not wage a bloody battle with the British to throw them out. I mean, we got our independence peacefully. Now, as the foreign minister also mentioned, India, therefore, is seen as a country that is ideally placed to play the role of a peaceful negotiator, a mediator, a bridge between a world which increasingly is getting polarized between US and Europe on the one hand and China and Russia on the other. This is a dangerous polarization, Neha. And we need a sensible, rational voice with authority, which can not just talk about its own interest, but also the interests of other countries, which are probably not at the high table of global affairs, for them to have a seat, a voice, and be heard, and their interests taken into account. And I think a lot of these countries have great, sort of comfort with India as a leader, which can actually be their voice, be sure that we take care of their interests, we take them along, because that is what the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam philosophy is all about. I mean, India is not talking about just growing it, on its own. There can be no prosperity or peace if we just focused on ourselves as one country. Now we know that how immigration problems of one country are spilling over into another country and creating massive social issues and problems in those countries. So I think India is ideally placed, Neha, and which is again why I would say that it was important that someone like Xi Jinping should have been there, so that we are able to establish this new role and give peace a chance and not hurtle the world towards, again, a dangerously polarized world where the Western powers are facing off against China and Russia, Neha. So I think that's a important role India needs to play. And I hope when Brazil picks up the presidency later this year, that they are able to continue this momentum which India has built and play as much a role as we have, over the last 1 year, Neha.
Well, absolutely. India can certainly take credit for that, and hopefully India's presidency will be remembered for exactly this. All right, let's now move on to our next story, which is from the United States of America, and this is significant for India's G20 summit. Here's why. In a major relief to India, the White House today confirmed that US President Joe Biden will undertake a trip to India as scheduled to attend the G20 summit. This announcement is significant considering that First Lady Jill Biden recently tested positive for COVID-19, and while President Biden has tested negative, there was some concern and uncertainty over his travel schedule. Remember, the US President is also scheduled to hold bilateral talks with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi a day ahead of the G20 summit in New Delhi. Earlier, Biden had expressed his disappointment over the decision by Chinese President Xi Jinping to skip the summit. Let's go back to Sri for more on this story. Sri, Biden may have expressed his disappointment that Xi is not coming, but I can tell you that all of India is heaving a sigh of relief that at least President Biden is coming to India for the G20 summit. There was a flutter and a bit of concern in this regard when the First Lady tested positive for COVID, but now it looks like all is well.
Absolutely, Neha. So I think this is a huge sigh of relief for the G20 attendees that President Biden will finally be making it. I think it's like sheer providence that the coronavirus decided to spare him. And it's really wonderful of him to actually make this trip, despite, the First Lady, testing positive for it. So I think India, appreciates that the President Biden is coming. Now, remember, Neha, there are two things why, President Biden's visit is really important, why, it matters to us. One is, of course, the fact that he's coming a day earlier to be able to meet with our Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, for bilateral talks. And as you know, the relationships between India and US have now gotten onto a totally new trajectory, a new strategic sphere, where we are talking about critical technology and, not just in the defense, but also in terms of information technology, manufacturing. And that is now also going to be supplemented, on the other hand, by defense collaboration, for example, Quad, to maintain stability in our part of the world. So his presence was extremely important for those reasons, for specific to India and US. Now, the other reason why, he needs to be there is because US is the most powerful country in the world, the largest economy. And as some of the key commitments are discussed, and countries come to agree on some of these key commitments, especially on the multilateral funding of nations, where US, don't forget, is a very large donor. It funds a lot of these multilateral institutions. So US being there and signing off on those agreements, especially on climate change, on other commitments, greenhouse reduction, I think those are very, very important issues on which the presence of President Biden was important. And we are really glad that, he's there. And we hope that his presence will propel the talks forward. And despite Xi Jinping's absence, we are able to see something constructive and qualitative come out of the G20 summit meeting at the end of it, Neha.
Well, absolutely. President Biden's visit is extremely important, not just for the G20 summit, but also because he's going to hold bilateral talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on the eve of the G20 summit. And of course, the two sides are hoping to take their relationship forward following Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent historic state visit to the United States. All right, let's now move on to our next story. This is from the US too, and this is also significant in the context of the G20 summit. Interestingly, ahead of the G20 summit in New Delhi, US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has called out China over its president's decision to skip the summit and send the country's premier instead. Sullivan said, as far as the question of tensions between India and China affecting the G20 summit are concerned, it's really up to China. If China wants to come in and play the role of spoiler, of course, that option is available to them, though we are hoping for a constructive and positive outcome. All right, let's go back to Shri at this point. Shri, many would find this interesting that while President Biden says he's disappointed that he won't get to meet his Chinese counterpart on the sidelines of the G20 summit, you have the National Security Advisor of the United States, in a sense, calling out China for its bullying, really, and, the fact that it's been acting difficult and adopting obstructionist approach, not just in terms of the fact that the Chinese president has chosen to skip the summit, but also in terms of the stand that China has taken at most of the G20 meetings that have taken place in India in the run-up to this summit. Now, what do you make of this particular remark by Jake Sullivan, that if China chooses to act as a spoiler, the option is available, it is welcome to do so, but we are of course hoping for a more positive and constructive approach and outcome. The question is that really asking for too much from China?
Correct. So, Neha, you have been pressing me and asking me if Mr. Xi Jinping's absence is because of the map issue or issues with India. And I have been saying that, well, that may be a part of the reason. But the bigger bone that China really has to pick is with the US, because US's shift away from China is what is really going to hurt China. It may slow down the country's growth. It may put it back in terms of decades, in terms of access to new technology. So the bigger fight that China has is not with India, but the US. Now, despite all the sanctions, to give the US administration credit, they have been making moves to friendly overtures and inviting China to come and talk about the issues that are in the way of a healthy relationship between US and China. But again, let's look at how China has treated US. Mr. Anthony Blinken, he's the foreign minister of US, Secretary of State. He was in China in June this year. And how did Mr. Xi Jinping treat him? I'm sure, Neha, you will recall that at this meeting, it was a long U table where Mr. Xi Jinping sat on the head of the table, but Mr. Blinken, he's very, very close to the US president. He's a confidant of the US president, and he goes on behalf of the US president. He was made to sit on the side, not at the head of the table. So, these are very, very childish gestures. I don't know what is the point that China is trying to make with all these gestures. Therefore, I'm not surprised that Mr. Jake Sullivan has called China a spoiler, because that's essentially what China is turning out to be. It's throwing a hissy tantrum, which is unbecoming a country of its stature, of its size, and its aspirations, most of all. I think it's high time China really rethought how it wants to engage with the world and become slightly more mature, not just in relation to India, but also in relation to US, from which it has benefited for decades in terms of technology, literally free IP, which today now enables China to become such a big producer of technology and defense equipment, Neha.
Right. While some may say that, these remarks are a jibe at China, perhaps this is more of an ominous warning of what might come. And let's certainly hope that Jake Sullivan's words don't prove prophetic in the days ahead. All right, moving on to our next story. This is from the United Kingdom, and this has an important India connect. Before embarking on his visit to India to attend the G20 Summit, British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak addressed his ministers on the issue of the pending free trade agreement with India, setting the stage for crucial trade talks with India. He made it clear that any trade agreement would only be accepted if it truly benefits the whole of the United Kingdom. Now, according to a spokesperson for Prime Minister Sunak, negotiations for a free trade deal between India and the UK have been making progress. Both nations have significant interests at stake. India sees this trade agreement as a critical step in expanding its export opportunities, while the UK, eager to diversify its trade portfolio after leaving the European Union, anticipates broader access for its products, including whiskey, premium cars and legal services. Despite the optimism surrounding these talks, several significant issues remain unresolved. These include intellectual property rights, rules of origin and an investment treaty. Notably, campaigners have expressed concern that the UK might demand provisions that could potentially harm India's generic drugs industry and lead to increased costs for consumers. Let's go back to Shri to understand this story better. Shri, even though both sides say that they have been working hard towards arriving at this deal, but clearly there are many hindrances at the moment because these efforts have been made for a while now. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was actually Rishi Sunak's predecessors who were expected to seal this deal with India, but it's not yet seen the light of day. So what are the primary concerns on both sides, and really how much longer do you think, realistically speaking, it could actually take for this deal to become a reality?
So Neha, actually these talks have been going on from the time of the former Prime Minister Theresa May, it has carried on since. But I think Mr. Sunak, to be fair to him, carries a tremendous burden on his shoulder, not just as a Prime Minister, but also as a man of Indian origin, and as someone who's married into the first family of Indian software industry. So I think it's a little unfair that the people in UK expect that he should be able to deliver what others have not managed to do, because the fundamental issue, the fundamental problem, Neha, which defines these trade talks, this is a free trade agreement we're talking about. This is like giving a free hand to a country, and there are very few countries with which we have FTAs. So the implication is this: the problem which has been dogging these talks is that the UK still seems to think that it is an empire, a superpower, which is talking down to, maybe an emerging, a poor India. but that is not the case any longer. Very soon we are going to be far bigger than UK. If in the nominal terms we are already bigger than them. So and we will be the third largest economy sooner or later. So I think the UK needs to realize that. And the products in which it wants the duties to be brought down are products like whiskey, cars, then legal services. Now, as far as India is concerned, our commitment is to the poor of the nations, like people who are suffering because of our tariffs. So our commitment would be to those people first. Now, whiskey is not consumed by poor people. Cars are not driven by poor people. Legal services, again, not consumed by a lot of poor people. So, to be honest, I don't see there is great urgency on India's part to actually sign this FTA. On the other hand, UK is far more keen because they have left, the European Union. Brexit has impacted them. Now they need a market like India to be able to sell their goods. But I think what would be recommended to UK would be to treat India at a more, at the level that it deserves, and not try to talk down or suggest that we are maybe a poorer, smaller economy, and therefore, we should defer to the UK. I think those days, unfortunately, are over, and India needs to be dealt with at a term that it thinks is fair and deserved.
Absolutely. So, well, we may have to wait a while to see this deal actually becoming a reality. For now, of course, the focus is on the G20 Summit. Thanks for that, Sri. But stay on with us. We're taking a quick break here on Global Lens. Plenty more on the other side. Don't go away.